Hey YouTube, how's it going? It's Max again. This video might be longer than expected. Which I probably shouldn't make a long intro, but I was thinking about splitting this up into three different videos because it's three different water-related world building ideas. They would have been a lot shorter, but I figured that I didn't want to. I mean, this is kind of silly, but I feel like I didn't really want to present three different videos to kind of drive up the moat count of videos to get closer to 100. So I figured that these were all kind of somewhat related. I know I do have done like part one, part two videos in the past, but I don't know. I just wanted to keep this all in one video instead of splitting it up. As an introduction, I wanted to give a couple disclaimers. So like this is not an educational video, so I'll be talking about a lot of real world concepts, and there's a lot of detail about them that I just don't know, I'm not aware of. The purpose of this is more to kind of present world building ideas than to kind of educate you on these topics. They're mostly my surface level thoughts, kind of translated into like creative ideas, if that makes sense. And I think I say this a lot in my videos, but I just want to make it clear, because like this is more like word vomit when you journal, rather than like me being some expert. Like I'm not good at trivia. I don't like remember a lot of the like fine details about these nuanced concepts. I record most of my videos in one take, so I don't like to do a lot of editing. So it's not like a bunch of factoids that I just kind of have written in front of me. Like some of them are factoids I have written, but it's not like the goal isn't to really educate you, I guess. It's more, like I said, just to kind of, talk conversationally. I'm not like a teacher or anything. I don't claim to be one. Me presenting this is probably not the best, but ultimately just not supposed to be factual. Purpose is just to be, fun, hence world building and stuff. Yeah, okay, so I guess we can get into it. So the first concept I wanted to talk about is the Rocky Mountain River, that flows to two different oceans. So in world building, and when you kind of study like how, um, I guess, rivers work, there's a general tip in map making where you want to have like a river start at a high elevation point and kind of go into an ocean at a low elevation point, sea level. And so when you're doing that, the river is flowing to the point of least resistance, the lowest point. That's how rivers kind of work, and they kind of carve their own path based on that principle. And then erosion can occur, and it can like kind of change the river over time, that kind of stuff. So usually when you're creating rivers in world building, you don't have forks in the road, or forks in the river, because it's generally thought of that you don't often find points where the river is going to split and have two equal points of low or of the same whatever resistance, and least resistance. And so typically, if you, in theory, if that were to happen, it would just flow towards the lowest point, and then like that other kind of output of the river would just stop kind of having water flow that way. It would just down the original kind of exit, I guess, if you will. So that's just generally like a general rule in world building. And what I kind of think is interesting about this is, like, so when you look at like the USA, there are, I would kind of split the USA into like three different like sections when it comes to like rivers. So like everything to the west of the Rocky Mountains typically by principle will flow into the Pacific Ocean, whereas anything between the Rocky Mountains and the Appalachians will flow into the Gulf of Mexico through the Mississippi. And this kind of goes back to the whole, rivers merge, they don't split kind of thing. So all these other rivers are kind of feeding into the Mississippi River, which kind of flows into the Gulf of Mexico, and then everything to the east of the Appalachians typically flows into the Atlantic. And I know I was talking a bit earlier about like rivers flowing, they don't split. There's some exceptions to this also when you get closer to the ocean. You see like more deltas and distributaries and stuff like that, um, that kind of flow into, they kind of split off because they're kind of at sea level. It's kind of like wetlands and swamps and just tidewater-ish regions. So I guess how this relates to this Rocky Mountain that flows into two different oceans concept is that this whole rule that I kind of described is a general rule in world building, but it's actually more common in reality than you think, um, having rivers split. And an example of this is islands in the middle of rivers where it kind of splits and goes around the island. It's that kind of concept, um, but it and this is where my the details are kind of fuzzy to me, because I'm not an expert. I don't think it happens as much on a large scale. So like with big rivers splitting into two different rivers going, I don't know if that's the case or not. But in this concept that I'm going to talk about with the Rocky Mountain River, that happens at a point. So there's this point in the Rockies in Wyoming. Um, and it's like this point called the Two Ocean Creek in Wyoming, and it's just in high elevation, and there's just this point in the river, and it's kind of considered a landmark where it splits into the Pacific Creek, which goes into the Pacific Ocean on the western, down the mountains on the western side, and then the Atlantic Creek, which goes down the mountains on the eastern side. And I think that it's just an interesting thing because of the whole idea of world building, how you don't want to like split rivers and stuff like that. But here is like a real example of that happening where it just happens that it just splits into two different rivers, kind of like that island principle, where it just kind of splits around. And I guess how I want to relate this to world building is that I think it's interesting to sort of have these concepts of, like, that are in your world that kind of defy expectations, but in a logical way that's been like kind of, I mean, like I'm not like an expert on this, so I wouldn't say like you're an expert on like how worlds work and how rivers work, but just kind of like at least you've given it thought and consideration. And so how I would kind of want to use this concept in my world for a world building is like, say there's like this settlement high up in the mountains, and they're defining features that the river splits into two. And for like people who are coming out this from the perspective of, oh, the river doesn't split in two, you can kind of further go into more detail about like the topography of the area, how it splits in two. And it's just kind of like a good, in my opinion, a good kind of entry point to describe the town in an interesting way. So maybe it's like a rocky town, and this river is just a very like, it goes along like the mountain's edge, so it's very um rocky, and there's a lot of like waterfalls that kind of split off into different rivers that go down different points of the um, mountain on different like faces. So some go down like maybe the western face, like the western or the Pacific Creek goes down the western side of the mountain. Well, another river kind of splits and goes down the east because of these waterfalls and just how the mountains are kind of formed. I think that would be like a very interesting visual for a location. And you could go on and use this river and kind of describe it almost like a Niagara Falls, where these are some really like, um, I guess, natural wonder level waterfalls that are just kind of cascading down the mountains. Um, and because of such, the beauty and just the interesting definition of what this river is, you can kind of play this into the, I guess, the lore of this region of the world that you're building. And so maybe these waterfalls are like worshipped like gods, or maybe like there's some origin stories about why the two rivers kind of split. Maybe they're personified in a way where they were, once together as like this one god, and they split into two different gods, and each god reigns over each side of the mountain, and this is like the mecca point of this culture, where it's like this is the point where the two gods split. Just cool things like that about the world, that are like landmarks and can really define cultures. So I guess, like, this is just one of the three concepts I wanted to talk about. The second one is the Colorado River, and this one is more of a, I guess, a topical kind of thing, I guess you could say. So, from my understanding, the Colorado River is kind of at this point in history where it's the lowest it's ever been. And there's this classic trope, I guess, in a lot of like fantasy where there's like a desert region and the river's drying up, and there's like this good guys versus bad guys thing where the people at the bottom of the river are often like the good guys who are being oppressed by the people at the top of the river, who are, kind of managing the river in a way where the people at the bottom of the river aren't able to get enough resources, so they have to go kind of solve the problem, often with force, to try and get the river to um, flow again. And that's just like I guess a classic plot you can use, but it's like, how can we make that plot more interesting? And I think this kind of political, um, uh, just like what you can do with like contracts, of this dilemma, and like adding more factions to the situation can really make this a more like fleshed out story than just like good guy versus bad guy. Bad guy is hogging water, good guy is, in need of water, good guy solves the problem. So like the actual Colorado River is, pretty much the lifeline that supplies 7 different states and Mexico. And so it starts kind of in the Wyoming and Colorado region and kind of flows down through, like, I think it's like Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, California, maybe Utah, and then ends in Mexico. And so there's a lot of different factions at play here. And given like recent experiences with drought, this kind of elevates the severity of the issue. And so when you're dealing with like 8 different regions that are all in the desert with little rainfall, it's important to kind of create this, system of water distribution that's fair to everybody. And when you're sort of also dealing with multiple countries, you have laws that, the U.S., if you're dealing with 7 states and then one Mexico, um, as being like 8 slices of the pie or whatever, Mexico automatically in that situation has less authority and power than the 7 states if each state and Mexico are all represented individually and equally. So that is also like kind of like a thing where it's like, if Mexico has like more different regions in Mexico, would that, like, say they added 3 different regions to the pie to create, like 10, because 7 states, 3 regions of Mexico, to create 10 pieces of the pie, does Mexico then have more say in the situation? You could kind of create little like political kind of distributions of jurisdiction over that. So if Mexico just continued to create, or even if the U.S., like if the U.S. created more states that shared borders with the river, could the U.S. in theory give itself more say in the political tension of claim over this river? So like naturally, that's just one example. Like, so naturally, like, and this is just something I don't really want to, I don't want to misrepresent it. So like, don't like think that like this is something that like, the U.S. is going to do, or the Mexico is going to do something like kind of unjust. This is just kind of like a real life example, that could drive a plot for a story based on a river with multiple factions trying to, share the water source. So like naturally, people who live like near where the river begins, they have the most access to water. And so like Colorado could be like, for in this example, um, the best, like the most powerful region. But you could also say like, and this isn't true, but like let's say Arizona, who's kind of in the middle of the Colorado River, let's say instead of it being like a desert arid region, maybe it's an area that's actually, very rich with water. Like they have a lot of springs or mountains that have more water sources that feed into the Colorado River. So maybe they, even though they're in the middle of the region, maybe they have more access to other sources of water that other regions don't necessarily have. And why I kind of want to bring this up is like when you're trying to come up with like a solution to this problem, sometimes it's not always splitting it evenly. So I was talking about like 1/8 per faction that's involved in this. Maybe instead, like they take into consideration that Colorado or Arizona in this hypothetical example have more access to other, either they're the source of the river or they have more access to other rivers. So maybe they shouldn't get as much access to the river, depending on the context of the situation. So that's really just to open up all these other elements of what you can factor into the water distribution. And so that also could equate to like maybe like Arizona has more annual rainfall, and that's another factor you have to um, put into the formula. But also, or like population sizes, which is also another thing. So let's say that like you also want to factor in population size, not just like an equal slice of the pie. So if Arizona has like 10 million people, I know that's not how much they have, but like Nevada has 5 million people, should Arizona get twice as much water as Nevada to kind of compensate? They're allowed to get more water because they need it to satisfy all these people. You could also factor in like farming. Maybe you need more farming or more water in this region because they are advocating, we need it for farming to supply the region with more food. So that could be another variable. And when you have these kind of variables established in the contract politically, then you can introduce more complications, such as people trying to, um, I guess, find loopholes in the system. So if it's like a population discrepancy, you could have another region, as a result of this population rule, try to impose another kind of incentive in their region to have people reproduce or create more offspring to increase the population numbers so they get more water from the river. Or they could do something such as, like, let's say Las Vegas, for example, there's a place like Las Vegas that's along this river, and they have a flux in tourist population, and maybe they want to do like a census of their population during peak tourist times to try to make the argument that they should get more water because they need to accommodate all these tourists that keep coming to their region, um, as just like another, I guess, complication in this whole contract system. I know this is a very like complicated issue that isn't really in a lot of stories, which is why I'm not like making a story about it. But I just think it's like an interesting kind of plot device where you're taking real world things and creating interesting, elaborate, complicated plots from them. And so another thing with this that's kind of interesting is just the idea of how are you even measuring the amount of water you're allocating. So before I was talking about, let's say you give 1/8 of the water to each piece of the pie. Um, but in order to give 1/8 of the pie, you need to have like a number, a whole number that you're kind of taking that from. So like if you're trying to factor in the annual precipitation of that year, you can't really know for certain what that's going to be until the year's over. So how are you um, going to be distributing this water evenly if you're just kind of using like a projected number, especially if there's a drought one year or there's like not a drought another year? Those numbers could be drastically different than each other. So one of the solutions, I think, if I recall, of the actual Colorado River problem is that, let's say there's like a total of 500 million gallons of water that's projected to flow down. Maybe Colorado is given like 80 million gallons of water, and then the next or the next state or faction is given 70 million, whatever is needed to satisfy their populations. But in a drought, if Colorado does take the 80 million gallons, then by the time it gets to Mexico, they might not get anything. if that makes sense. So that's like just more complications to the problem, and especially factoring in those kind of conflicts of, like, say Mexico doesn't have as much of a say, they get the short end of the stick because they're the last ones and they're the only faction that's of a different country. There's just all these different complications to the problem that you can present. And you can throw into, okay, so now there's a war going on in the region, and the people in the, I guess, that at the top of the river can now, are incentivized to poison the water source for everyone below them if they wanted to. There's just tons of possibilities you can do with an example like the Colorado River. So that's why I kind of wanted to talk about that. And I just want to say one more time that, naturally, these issues are very complicated in reality, and I don't really, obviously, I'm not, as well educated as I probably could be on this. It's more just for fun, hypothetical. Let's talk about this with the intent of potentially creating cool stories from it, rather than to reiterate what's going on in reality. So don't use this information to sort of frame your worldview about what's going on in that region. Just kind of, take it with a grain of salt and think about it from a hypothetical. Another idea, the third idea I want to talk about, hopefully we can get through this pretty quick because we're at 21 minutes, is maritime law, which is basically what are the laws out at sea, and who owns the sea, who owns the rights to what goes on there, and who can enforce that, etc. And so in world building, there's often those people who have, you always have those factions on land, but on sea, it's usually like, I think the go-to is usually like, oh, the pirates or the sea monsters or the weather, or is like the things that happen in sea. It's like a lawless Wild West, but the sea. And what I kind of wanted to focus on in this area is this concept called the exclusive economic zone. There's a couple different types of zones, and I'm going to link all these videos if you want to do more research with like people who are more qualified to talk about this than me. But essentially, um, off the coast of countries, there's like for the economic exclusive zone specifically, there's like 200 miles of, I guess, kind of like rights to that sea where people can, uh, the country that owns it can prevent other countries from coming in there and fishing in there or mining for oil in there. They basically like treat it as if it's their land, and they can apply laws to that air, to that realm of sea. And then there's like other kind of laws that can say, well, like if a country is traveling through that zone without any intent to do any of these things, they can do so without getting told or whatever. And told, I mean like they don't have to pay a fine or something to travel through them. There's just all these kind of laws for sea navigation. And I bring up the tolls because you could either include this in your world, or you could say, you could be like, no, there's no tolls. Whereas like this could be a huge traveling issue in your world, where if all this one power controls all this kind of maritime um real estate, I guess you could say, like just kind of like zones in the ocean, that like it's preventing people from like traveling and trading with other regions because they're just kind of monopolizing the space and causing all these tolls. That could be an interesting, I guess, detail to add, that it kind of adds some political intrigue, as opposed to it just being about pirates or sea monsters or whatever. Or you could include those and be like, the people either have the choice to go into open waters where they can deal with the lawless and wilderness of monsters and whatnot, or they can go the safe route along the coast, and that is the alternative, I guess. And this is also very common in areas like the Suez Canal and Panama Canal, where certain regions try to occupy those territories and build a canal system that connects two major oceans through a narrow passage of land, uh, so that trade can be facilitated and you can make profit, kind of tolling, you know, rival nations or whatever. Um, that needed to trade. And this was like mostly before air transportation and stuff like that. So this would probably be a mostly, um, say, like 1700s colonial time based world. Or, but even in like modern days, people still like use those kind of passages, just because you can put so much on a ship. Anyways, kind of uh, getting off topic, but I really like the idea of, and again, I like the idea of world building, I guess, in this like kind of colonial era where like there are these superpowers that are trying to claim land and resources and basically imperialize. Because I think that that has a lot of, I guess there is like a lot of like evils you can kind of play with in that kind of like greed. Um, but also it's like there's a lot of different perspectives in that. Like there's some people who are trying to, um, like they genuinely think that they're making the world a better place. And I often like to tie this to like, religious concepts, because even in the modern day, I think that there are people who genuinely are trying to make the world a better place by imposing their ideas on others. And so I think that this message is still very relevant today. Even if you mean well, you can still do a lot of harm and impact on people. So I just think that that's an interesting message to kind of have in stories. But that's also kind of besides the point. Um, Sorry, I lost my train of thought. So, anyways, another kind of concept I want to play with this exclusive economic zone is the concept of islands, and having a lot of islands that might not even be marked on your world map if you create those. But pretty much, if your global powers are trying to control certain islands for strategic purposes to have more like area of effect on the sea. So if you have like a small island that's maybe only like 10 miles, radius, but if you impose this economic exclusive zone or whatever, where there's 200 miles of, ownership in that area, then you're claiming just like these small rocks in the middle of the ocean, but they have such an impact on trade that can be facilitated through that area, if that makes sense. So you can kind of play with that kind of idea. Um, and this also gets interesting when you start dealing with like archipelagos and just like clusters of islands, because if one region or one nation controls one island on the archipelago, but a rival region controls another on the same archipelago, it can really confuse who owns what in that kind of radius. People can say it's closer to this where my coast is, and other people could, hire their own cartographers and map makers to try to prove that it's actually closer to mine. And it's like, this is at the end of the day, the sea, who owns that, who controls it, and it's supposed to be this contract agreement that everyone's agreeing to, but people are, refusing to uh, agree, especially if it's like a very important resource like oil, or like some you might want to have magic in your world, and there's maybe a well of like magical energy that you can be mined from the sea here. So just a lot to play with. You can also talk about like things like what are the laws on the ships that can pass through there. So like for example, if there's a slave ship that's carrying slaves from one island to another, but they have to pass through this region that's in the exclusive economic zone where they outlaw slavery. Um, do they have to pass through checkpoints, stuff like that? Same with drugs or other illicit things that could be confiscated or whatever. And like, what are the consequences? Um, what's the I guess the consequences, and what's the procedures of handling that? And that's very almost like when you think of like if you've seen like Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul, where they're trying to like transport like drugs through these kind of elaborate using these elaborate tactics to get the product from point A to point B. You can kind of play with those concepts in your story just to make them a bit more interesting. And one other example I wanted to do about maritime law and this whole ship related stuff is this idea, especially because nowadays, like immigration has been a pretty big issue over the past couple of years. You could have this concept where there's this nation that's very strict on its immigration laws. And let's say like a pregnant mother is really wanting to have like her child be a citizen of this specific nation, and based on the written rules of your world with the exclusive economic zone, if she has a child, it gives birth to a child in that zone, in those waters, by law, maybe there's a loophole or something, they that kid becomes a legal citizen of that region that is very strict on its immigration laws. So you could kind of have that be like a character's backstory or something of how they became a citizen here, and maybe they're trying to do whatever. But like, I don't know, it's just like you can take these kind of concepts and run with them as you want to. um, I just think that, in conclusion, there's endless material in these kinds of like examples in the real world that I really like to kind of just learn about, and just kind of brainstorm cool potential stories from them. And oftentimes there's like just so much out there in our world that I'm just, too lazy to write them. But I enjoy talking about them and sharing these thoughts and concepts. And if it does inspire someone to, write cool stories based off them, then I think that's awesome. So, you know, just a little fun chat for a half hour. Hope that you have a good day, and I'll see you later. Later days.